For many nations around the world that traditionally deprioritized defense spending, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was something of a shock to the system. What many leaders once considered impossible was now a reality. And as a result, 2022 saw a surge of bureaucrats around the world hurriedly rewriting their national defense policies. For many countries, peace dividends and ammunition supplies only sufficient to fight war for a couple of weeks were out, and credible deterrence was back in fashion. A lot of the attention, quite understandably, tends to be focused on Europe. That, after all, is where the war is being fought. And since February last year, we've seen a number of European nations make seismic changes to their forward defence policy. Germany, Sweden, Finland and Poland all come to mind. But half a world away, a number of nations in Asia are also looking at developments with growing anxiety. Japan is one of those nations. After more than half a century of staunch pacifism and relatively minimal defence budgets, Japan has looked at the changing international situation, including its own ongoing territorial disputes, and decided a frantic change is required. Germany drew global attention when Chancellor Scholz announced a €100 billion special fund to help get the Bundeswehr in order. But Japan's planned investment over the next 5 years may be considerably larger. This massive investment program, if it goes ahead, will fundamentally transform the capabilities of the Japanese self-defense forces. It will include the development and deployment of new technologies, and among other things will, for the first time since World War II, give Japan the capability to practically hit targets that may be thousands of kilometres from the home islands. So what I'm going to try and do today is give a holistic, high-level picture of Japan's rearmament plans. That means talking about Japan's military history to put these developments in context, and also Japan's fundamental strategic position. Because every nation's resources and geopolitical situation is different, and the design of their militaries flow from that. So we'll look at the Japanese self-defense forces as they existed in 2022, both the forces themselves and the supporting defense industrial base. Then we'll look at the change in strategic thinking put forward by Japan since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How do they see the world, and what do they want the Japanese self-defense forces to be able to do? That'll flow into a discussion of how they plan to do it, what is Japan looking to purchase, what capabilities is it looking to build up, and critically, how is Japan looking to leverage its position as a military ally of countries throughout the Indo-Pacific in order to achieve those security aims. Finally, because I can be a little bit of a downer, we're going to close out with some challenges that this process is likely to face, and some example options of how those challenges might be overcome. So we'll open, as we often do, with a little bit of history. Modern events seldom happen in a vacuum, and if you look close enough, you may see ripples that date back decades or even centuries. And so I get the enviable task of trying to compress millennia of history onto 1 or 2 slides. Now obviously, Japanese warfare evolved considerably over the course of many centuries. But I think the popular international image of historical Japanese warfare is most closely aligned with the feudal armies of periods like the Sengoku Jidai. This is a period of over a century running from the 1400s to 1500s, in which Japan largely lacks a strong central government. And just as in so many other cases where central authority collapses, the result was near constant warfare between feudal lords. In Japan, that was the daimyo. And their armies were made up both of hereditary military nobility, the samurai, and of course soldiers drawn from the much more numerous peasantry, the ashigaru. In that way, they weren't markedly different from feudal armies seen around the world in this period. Comparing Japanese samurai to European knights, for example, isn't a perfect comparison, but it's close enough to be useful. Where I think the popular history can fall down is when it paints the samurai as unchanging in their military thinking or techniques. I don't want to point fingers, but I feel like a certain Tom Cruise film might be partly to blame here. This is basically the conception that Japanese military practice and tradition is timeless and unchanging until Westerners get involved. This is where you get that Hollywood image of the samurai as conservative and honour bound, charging down an army with Gatling guns armed with nothing but swords, spears, bows and arrows. These Hollywood samurai are honour bound to the point of being complete idiots. They look down on firearms as somehow being dishonourable and put all their faith in the way of the sword. But here's the thing, the historical samurai liked guns so much they may as well have been honorary Texans. The samurai who led the Satsuma Rebellion, on which I believe the last samurai was very loosely based, Saigo Takamori, had started an artillery school before the outbreak of the rebellion, and his rebelling force used not just muskets but also several dozen cannon. And the story of the adoption of firearms in Japan shows that that's not some anomaly. In the early 1500s, you have a ship wreck itself on the Japanese island of Tanegashima. As a result of that shipwreck, the Japanese lord of the island reportedly gets his hands on 2 Portuguese-built matchlocks. No blueprints, no instructions, just the guns. By 1549, one particularly ambitious Japanese daimyo, Oda Nobunaga, is ordering about 500 matchlocks, which is something but certainly not an industrial quantity. But less than 18 years later, you have the daimyo of the Takeda clan declaring that firearms are the most important weapon in the army. The Japanese go from importing relatively small collections of European firearms to mass manufacturing their own improved versions. They increase the caliber, introduce methods to protect the firing mechanism during rain. There were Last Samurai-style cases of troops equipped with older weapons being gunned down by gun-equipped infantry, but they were much earlier than the 19th century and there were no Tom Cruise-style characters involved. Instead, you had battles like Nagashino in 1575, where Takeda cavalry and infantry were gunned down by thousands of musketeers sheltering behind prepared fortifications. So it's fair to say that Japanese military thinking through much of its history was fairly conservative, but also prone to fits of rapid modernization. They may resist an idea for some time, but damn it, once they decide to adopt it, they're going to adopt it. You see that kind of innovation in the 16th century. The Japanese armies that invade Korea, for example, use firearms to great effect. But once Japan gets a strong central government again with the rise of the Tokugawa shoguns, that kind of innovation grinds to a screeching halt, because for more than 2 centuries, Japan essentially embraces a policy of isolationism. The country itself is largely at peace, the ownership of weapons and feudal armies is restricted, and foreign influence is focused on a couple of designated locations. Japanese military thinking falls into a kind of stasis, waiting for some sort of shock to the system to get it moving again. That shock to the system comes in 1853 when American Commodore Matthew Perry sails into Tokyo Bay. The American government at the time wanted to see Japan opened up to proper international trade. The shoguns obviously disagreed, but Perry had some pretty strong arguments. Namely, he had steam-powered ironclad warships equipped with modern artillery. Meanwhile, Japan, after 2 centuries of ignoring the military tech tree, had basically the same Tanegashima-style muskets that it did 2 centuries earlier. There had been some efforts at modernization, but nowhere near enough. And so America was able to ask Japan to open up, and with the or else being so readily apparent, open up Japan did. It was a painful years-long process that would ultimately destabilize the Tokugawa shogunate. But with Western pressure and Western power being very obvious, there was no going back. Now, having armoured warships used to forcibly renegotiate your trade policy is a significant emotional event. And it was enough to once again jolt Japan from conservatism to frenetic modernization. With the fall of the Tokugawa shoguns and the Meiji Restoration, Japan embarked on a period of breakneck modernization. After centuries of trying to keep the foreigners out, now Japan was happy to invite foreign experts in, with basically the goal of copying what the Japanese saw as the most successful international models. For the Navy, that meant copying the British Royal Navy, sending officers to be trained in Britain, purchasing modern warships from British builders, etc. And for the Army, that meant bringing in French military advisors, adopting European uniforms and Western-style weapons. A conscription-based military was established in the 1870s, with conscription also being used essentially as a tool of social change and re-engineering. And the capabilities of the Imperial Japanese armies and navies would grow rapidly from there. By 1894, Japan was strong enough to resoundingly beat China during the First Sino-Japanese War. And only 10 years later, Japan would shock the world by resoundingly defeating the Russian Empire. The Imperial Japanese Navy would sink the bulk of both the Russian Pacific and Baltic fleets, and spark a political crisis in Russia so bad that it almost resulted in revolution. In the end, only 50 years would separate Japan being intimidated by Perry's expedition of 4 European-style ships, to their decisive defeat of one of Europe's great military powers. Unfortunately for Japan and much of Asia, its military ambitions wouldn't end there. The army and the navy grew incredibly powerful within Japanese politics. The share of the budget devoted to both grew to unsustainable levels, and militarist thinkers looked to territorial and imperial expansion as a solution to Japan's economic problems, namely the shortage of raw materials. Expansion in Korea, Manchuria, and the rest of China would follow, often at truly horrendous cost to the local population, with the Americans eventually responding to Japanese aggression by cutting off the supply of American oil. Now, if you're ever looking for proof that you're smart enough to be a leader of a major nation, think no further than this particular case. You are the leader of Japan. The Americans have cut off the supply of vital oil because you are invading China. What do you do? Because I guarantee whatever you just came up with is smarter than the actual plan. The plan they come up with, of course, was to attack the European colonial powers in Asia, including the United Kingdom, and to try and seize resource-rich holdings like the Dutch East Indies. And since that might draw in the Americans, plus the Philippines would be a nice place to have, the decision was made to sucker punch the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Because of course America would logically respond to such an attack by recognizing Japanese holdings and declaring it was all fair play, as opposed to, I don't know, mobilizing its immense industrial potential to ruthlessly crush the Japanese war machine. Like so many war plans through history, it had a great plan on how to gain an initial military advantage. What it lacked was a reasonable plan on what to do if the other side refused to give up when they were meant to. I'll leave the audience to make any comparisons they want to make to any other modern conflicts. World War II had a major impact on Japanese military potential. Namely, before the war they had military potential, and after the war it was gone. With its merchant ships being sunk, Manchuria being invaded by the Soviet Union, its cities being leveled by American bombing, and then finally by the deployment of nuclear weapons, the Japanese would essentially concede to unconditional surrender, with the emperor going on radio to state that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Japan would be placed under Allied occupation, but it's important here not to gloss over the immense bitterness and cost of that war. Perhaps 20 million people had died in China, and atrocities had been committed more or less everywhere the Japanese military went. There was absolutely no appetite between the Allied nations for the Imperial Japanese armies and navies to survive as institutions. Like Germany, Japan would be thoroughly disarmed. That disarmament and Japanese legal pacifism was and remains entrenched in the Japanese constitution. More than that, these pacifist ideals continue to play a large part in Japanese political thought. Article 9 of that document declares that the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. It also explicitly renounces the right of belligerency, making it virtually impossible for a Japanese government to unilaterally start a war. Article 9 also provides that Japan will not maintain war potential, including land, sea, and air forces. Now, that sounds on paper like an even more significant restriction, but the lawyers soon had their way with that one. Japan doesn't maintain war potential, it maintains only defensive potential, and it doesn't have an army, a navy, or an air force. It has ground, air, and maritime self-defense forces. That particular creative workaround aside, modern Japan doesn't invest for many decades much in its defensive capabilities. Over the last 30 years, for example, defence spending has been very approximately 1% of GDP. NATO's target is 2%. In America, the recent figure has usually been north of 3%, while Russia, even before the outbreak of full-scale war in Ukraine, was north of 4%. Relative to the size of its economy, Japanese military spending just wasn't that significant. But things started to change in the 21st century. Regional developments like the nuclearization of North Korea or the growth of the People's Republic of China as a major regional military power all increased anxiety levels in Tokyo, where Japan's existing strategy of more or less hiding behind the United States Navy and Air Force was seen as more and more problematic. As such, there were changes around the edges to Japan's overall pacifistic outlook. In 2014, Article 9 of the Constitution was not altered, but it was reinterpreted. It was now understood that Japan could act in self-defense not just of itself, but also of its allies. The logic presumably being that if Japan simply sat on the sidelines waiting for its allies to be defeated, then its prospects of defending itself once the threat eventually turned on them would likely be minimal. There were new and clarified principles for conditions under which Japan might consider using military force. But crucially, increases to military spending itself during this period were relatively conservative. Again, the Japanese military has two settings: staunch conservatism and rapid change. And rapid change tends to only happen after a significant external shock. The role of 2022's Commodore Perry would be Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. The invasion of Ukraine would help catalyze growing Japanese security fears and prompt a significant response. Prime Minister of Japan, Kishida Fumio, would announce a 26% year-on-year increase in Japan's defense budget, with an intention to double it by fiscal year 2026. Japan would publish a new defense outlook, a new defense strategy, and a new defense build-up plan, all intended to transform the capabilities of the Japanese self-defense forces. We're going to look at those documents in this presentation and the way they, at the stroke of a pen, discard taboos Japan has imposed on itself for decades in terms of the weapon systems it can possess. But before we do so, we need to look at Japan's strategic and geographical position. Because in order to understand why Japan's military transformation plans lack any sense of chill, it's important to understand the situation Japan finds itself in. Japan is a relatively developed industrial nation of approximately 126 million people. Japan's post-war economic growth was extremely quick, making it a major economic power. Go back to the 1980s and there were even those economists who thought that it would one day overtake the economy of the United States. Now, the 1991 asset bubble collapse in Japan and the subsequent lost decade or decades put paid to that dream. But depending on what measure you use, this is still the third or fourth largest economy in the world, and the yen still has a role as a minor reserve currency. Give a central bank an option of holding either yen or yuan, usually, statistically speaking, they'll still choose yen. And so in that sense, Japan has a lot going for it. On the other hand, Japan catastrophically lost the game of geographical bingo. So far as economy building goes, the Japanese home islands are a hard mode start. Agricultural land is pretty sparse and most agriculture that does exist has to be heavily supported. There's also very little in the way of mineral and energy resources. Japan as a nation doesn't have the ability to just dig up dirt or pump oil in order to make it rich. And usually a nation doesn't get to be a developed economy when fish is near the top of its list of natural resources. But the Japanese economy does work through the power of infrastructure, capital accumulation, value-adding industries, and a hard-working, highly skilled workforce. But it does mean the economy is extremely globalized and dependent on maritime trade. Japanese manufacturing and industry aren't built on Japanese resources, they're built on critical imports. That's particularly obvious when it comes to energy and raw materials. Japan is either, depending on the year, the first or second largest LNG importer in the world, the third largest coal importer in the world, a major importer of ores, pharmaceuticals, and machinery. And with relatively limited agricultural land and a population of 126 million, the country is not food independent. If all international trade stopped tomorrow, Japan would be in the unfortunate position of not being able to feed perhaps half its population. From an economic perspective, this makes perfect sense. Japan is able to focus on those industries where it has a comparative advantage and bring in those things it needs from overseas. But from a security perspective, this raises a significant issue, because it makes Japan incredibly dependent on the continued free flow of maritime trade. And while the state takes precautions like having a significant strategic oil reserve, it wouldn't take much to send the Japanese economy into shock if that vulnerable maritime umbilical was ever cut. I mean, to crystallize the comparison, what we can do is compare Japan to a state which is able to endure sanctions relatively well, like Russia. Russia is food and energy secure. It sells energy and agricultural products abroad rather than bringing them in. So while a shutdown of imports can degrade the capital base, slow down secondary production, and lower quality of life, it's not going to cause people to starve or the lights to go out. Russia had a low level of government debt and significant foreign exchange reserves. Japan has some of the highest government debt in the world. And Russia's exports, by contrast, are usually the kind of things the global market can't do without, things that are highly commodified like oil and gas. Japan's greatest export category, by contrast, is cars, which, while they may be excellent and cost competitive, are things, ultimately speaking, the market could choose to do without. Most economies could survive without a constant supply of brand new Toyotas, but the shitboxes they're driving instead still need a constant supply of oil. In short, Japanese economic prosperity is closely tied to regional stability and free and open maritime trade routes. Nor is that strategic vulnerability purely hypothetical. America put the theory to the test during World War II, and it worked. Despite Japanese construction efforts, by the time the war ended, 75% of the merchant fleet's tonnage was gone. And if America had gone to war with torpedoes that actually worked, well, those results probably would have been achieved far sooner. Without the ability to ship things like oil and raw materials from their newly conquered holdings back to the industrial centres of the homeland, the Japanese war economy was significantly hamstrung. And the economy of 2022 is far more globalised than that of 1944. And one of the implications of this is that in order to defend itself, it's not enough for the Japanese to just defend the Japanese home islands. They also have to have the capacity to keep those maritime trade lines open. The other key aspect of Japan's strategic situation that I thought is worth noting are its relationships with the major regional powers. Japan's diplomatic relations with some nations in the region have long been tense. This is particularly the case when you look at some of those nations that suffered under Japanese occupation or aggression during the Second World War. According to one poll I found in 2022, about half of South Koreans still expressed a negative view of Japan. Now that's an improvement from 77% a decade earlier, but this is still in a country which should be one of Japan's major security partners. In China in 2021, the figure was even higher, with 66% expressing a negative view. And that number is highly volatile, having spiked above 90% when territorial disputes flare up. And then there's North Korea. Now, we don't have reliable public polling data, surprisingly, on the attitudes of the North Korean people towards the nation of Japan. But I would suggest, given the tendency of North Korean state media to openly talk about destroying Japan in nuclear fire and occasionally launching missile tests over Japanese territory, that there might be some small degree of hostility there. Even setting North Korea's ongoing missile campaign against Pacific sea life aside, the relationship is very clearly incredibly hostile. Now, those are only small public opinion polls, and ultimately geopolitics isn't a popularity contest. But those numbers do provide a degree of context. Perhaps more significantly, Japan has active territorial disputes with both the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. China claims a number of islands that Japan currently administers, while in turn Japan claims many of the Kuril Islands currently administered by Russia. And those disputes help define and shape the environment that the Japanese Self-Defense Force finds itself operating in. If you're the JSDF, your nation has no natural resources, vulnerable maritime lines of supply and communication, and territorial disputes with two major regional military powers. Not the most enviable of strategic positions. Which brings us to the JSDF of 2022, and the forces and equipment that Japan had available before it embarked on its rearmament program. Now, just as in Germany, the disarmament of Japan didn't last particularly long after the end of World War II. While it had seemed like a great idea at the time to the Allied powers, with the emergence of the Cold War, it suddenly became vital that Japan, like Germany, had some ability to defend itself. As a result, the JSDF was officially established in 1954, and in terms of total military funding, has generally hovered at the low end of the global top 10 over the last decade. According to 2022 military balance figures, in that year Japan had approximately 250,000 active personnel, including paramilitary forces, and about 56,000 reservists. That's enough to make it relatively large by European standards, but quite small by the standards of the region, particularly when compared to the armies maintained by the two Koreas and the People's Republic of China. The Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force is the largest component, with about 151,000 active personnel in 2022. But its equipment profile reflects its rather unique mission. While it does have a significant main battle tank and artillery fleet, including something like 100 Type 10 MBTs, one of the most modern in the world in 2022, it doesn't have the kind of overwhelming artillery arsenals you would see in South Korea, North Korea, or the PRC. What it does have are things like ground-based air defences and anti-ship missiles, things that come in handy when you're choosing to defend islands. And a lot of this stuff is indigenously built and relatively modern. If you're talking about the anti-ship missile launching vehicles, which are basically trucks with missile systems on the back of them, the most modern, the Type 12s, only entered service in 2015. And as for ground-based air defences, those include both Patriot batteries and the indigenously built Type 03. That's a medium-range SAM system with an AESA radar and a service entry date of 2003. Which, given the age of most of the GBAD systems currently engaged in Ukraine, makes the Type 03 the Gen Zeta in the room full of boomers. Even before 2022, there had been some changes being made in the ground self-defense forces, particularly in the field of standing up what's called an Amphibious Rapid Deployment Brigade, which is a force designed to give the JSDF some flexibility in defending its outlying islands. Japan couldn't really rely on an opponent obligingly landing their entire army on Honshu and then fighting a pitched battle on the outskirts of Tokyo. So instead, they've been steadily building up a pool of amphibious landing assets, transport helicopters, and the training and resources necessary to build up a brigade that basically functions as a very lightweight version of the US Marine Corps. A ground combat unit that's capable of going to an island that may already have been occupied and seizing it back by force. Now, for the JSDF, there's still a long way to go in this area. This is not a force that's going to be storming the beaches of Normandy anytime soon, nor is it anything like an equivalent to a Marine Expeditionary Unit. But it does demonstrate a Japanese willingness to focus on the challenge of defending and, if necessary, reclaiming some of its far-flung islands. which may in turn deter anyone from attempting anything like a Falklands Island scenario. The Japanese air self-defense forces are smaller by headcount, roughly 47,000 in 2022, but they do have a comparatively high concentration of Japan's shinier materiel. Japan operates three primary types of frontline fighter aircraft, 201 F-15Js and DJs, with the DJ being the training version. There are a bit over 90 of the F-2s, which is Japan's super version of the F-16, and a small but steadily growing number of F-35As. So there are things the Japanese air self-defense forces are clearly well provisioned to do. They've got the fighter airframes to do air defense work, and they've got a reasonable fleet of AWACS and early warning aircraft, again to help with that air defense mission. But there are other areas where they're clearly short relative to other air forces. Namely, that they have very little ability to project power very far from their home air bases. Japan doesn't have particularly many air refueling tankers, and as at the moment, no air-launched cruise missiles. It's also seen its technological edge relative to some of its potential opponents narrow considerably in the 21st century. When F-15J entered service, the primary aircraft of the People's Liberation Army Air Force were things like the J-7, the Chinese version of the 1960s era MiG-21. But in 2022, with China operating a growing fleet of 5th-generation J-20s among other modern aircraft, the F-15's old advantages are nowhere near as convincing as they once were. Japanese pilots and airframes have also had to deal with an increasing tempo of operations over the last decade, with the chart on the screen there showing the changing number of scrambles by Japanese fighters against Chinese aircraft year on year. In 2009, the Japanese scrambled 38 times to intercept Chinese aircraft. In fiscal year 2021, that number was 722. Add in those intercepts of Russian aircraft probing Japanese defences, and Japanese pilots are in the air a lot more often than you might think, which basically makes this a legal way to inflict attrition on your opponent. The more they scramble, the more they tax their aircraft engines and airframes, the more maintenance work needs to be done, and the more airframes need to be replaced. It's the kind of competition I can imagine some obscenely rich kids coming up with. Essentially, you both have to light a fire using nothing but $100 bills, and the person who keeps their fire burning longer by continuing to throw more money into the flames is declared the winner. The winner of what, you might ask? Well, wouldn't you like to know? You loser. From a strategic perspective, I think there's an argument that the Japanese maritime self-defense forces are probably the most significant. There are about 45,000 personnel involved, as well as about 10,000 involved in naval aviation. Now that might seem like a relatively low headcount, but this is Japan, so be prepared for a very high metal to manpower ratio. In 2022, the Japanese operated 49 principal surface combatants. Contrast that to America operating 124. That includes 39 destroyers, including 8 equipped with the American-built Aegis combat system. For those of you who aren't familiar with the system, Aegis is a primarily naval but also ground-based system that you buy when you want the ability to see everything in the sky and make everything you don't like go away. It's essentially a combination of extremely powerful sensors, weapon systems, and command and control systems that build awareness against threat types from cruise missiles to aircraft to ballistic missiles and allow you to task weapons to intercept. Now, not all Aegis systems are created equal. Not all, for example, have anti-ballistic missile capabilities, but Japan crucially does. It's the kind of system that would be really useful if you happen to have an unstable, aggressive neighbour with a small collection of nuclear missiles. So gee, I wonder why Japan bought it. There's also a very significant anti-submarine warfare capability, both fixed-wing and in the form of helicopters, and quite a significant fleet of 22 diesel-electric submarines. Now these deserve a little bit of a call-out, because 22 is a reasonable fleet number. The United States, in terms of its attack submarines, operates only just north of 50. Of course, America's boats are nuclear-powered behemoths. Japan's are much smaller, compact diesel-electric designs. But here's the thing, America's submarines have to be nuclear-powered behemoths because they have to be able to transit, the Pacific Ocean. Japan's, meanwhile, are based in, Japan, which means the range limitations associated with their chosen method of propulsion doesn't matter nearly as much. A lot of that submarine force is also quite modern. The Soryu class, which makes up about half of the fleet, includes in many of its boats Swedish air-independent propulsion technology, which helps reduce the impetus on a submarine to come close to the surface in order to gulp up some precious oxygen. So there clearly are some significant capabilities here. But one thing is very obviously missing from the list I put in front of you, something that defines naval power for the United States, and which has become an increasing focus of investment for the People's Liberation Army Navy. And so you're probably asking the question, does Japan have aircraft carriers? And the answer, of course, is depends. Because you see, warship designations are a little bit flexible. To illustrate the point, let me introduce you to this famous Russian floating ecological disaster. This is the Admiralflota Sovetskogo Soyuza Kuznetsov, more commonly known to the fun folks on the internet as either the Admiral Kuznetsov or that Russian ship that keeps catching fire in dry dock. Now, here are some key statistics about the Kuznetsov. It displaces about 53,000 tons standard, and in terms of armament, it has 12 long-range heavy anti-ship missiles. Compare that to 16 on the Moskva, which was a ship of 9,300 tons. So a ship of less than a fifth of the displacement has a larger anti-ship missile complement. It also carries a significant number of anti-aircraft missiles and 24 fixed-wing aircraft and 6 helicopters. There is a picture of it on the right. Now, many of you will look at that and go, that ship looks awfully like an aircraft carrier, being as it's a ship which carries aircraft. But calling it an aircraft carrier would cause Russia problems. Because based on Turkey's interpretation of the Montreux Convention, which is the convention which allows the Turkish government to regulate passage up and down the Dardanelles Strait, if Kuznetsov had been an aircraft carrier, it might not have been allowed through, which would have been a problem for the Kuznetsov considering she was built in the Black Sea. Luckily for the Russians, Kuznetsov clearly isn't an aircraft carrier. She's a heavy aircraft carrying cruiser. You see, those two squadrons of combat aircraft are secondary weapons. The primary weapon system are those 12 P-700s. And so the Kuznetsov has absolutely no problem transiting through the Turkish Strait, travelling between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, provided, of course, we're talking about a time when its engines happen to be working. Now, Japan seems to have hired some of Russia's lawyers because it's time to introduce you to the Izumo and the Kaga. I'm going to give you some statistics about the Izumo and the Kaga, and you can guess what class of warship they represent. They each displace around 20,000 tons standard. Their entire armament suite is made up of 4 close-in weapon systems, 2 Phalanx and 2 CRAM. Basically, these are very short-range weapon systems that only exist to shoot down projectiles like missiles that are coming to attack the ship. It has no long-range cannons and no long-range missiles. What they do have is that long flight deck-looking thing, which officially is there to enable the operation of a small complement of helicopters. Completely coincidentally, however, Japan has ordered a number of F-35Bs, which is the short takeoff and vertical landing version of the F-35, officially for land-based operations flying from bases very close to the home port of ships like Izumo and Kaga. On another completely unrelated note, F-35Bs can land and take off from Izumo and Kaga. US Marine Corps F-35s have done exactly that in exercises. So it's a ship with a long flight deck, no offensive weapons, that has the capacity to land, support and take off F-35Bs. And so I ask you the question, does Japan have any aircraft carriers? And the answer, of course, is no. Obviously, carriers sound like a very offensive weapon. So Izumo and Kaga are very clearly helicopter-carrying multi-mission destroyers. I'm glad we've cleared up that misunderstanding. Let's move on. So in aggregate, you're looking at an on-water force that is specialised around certain capabilities, which is kind of inevitable when you're building a navy and you're any nation other than the US or China. Japan is pretty good at naval-based air defense, including shooting down ballistic missiles. It's got a relatively strong and modern submarine corps, and it's good at hunting opposing submarines. What it lacks is the ability to project power at very long geographical distances, and it also lacks standoff capabilities. Without either aircraft carriers or cruise missiles, the ability of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force to hit targets at very long range is quite limited, especially if, for some reason, it's dangerous for ships to approach close to an enemy-held shore. Say, for instance, if they were facing an opponent that invested incredibly heavily in long-range anti-ship missiles. The other element of looking at Japan's existing capabilities is examining its defense industrial base. Because as the war in Ukraine is demonstrating quite clearly, what you can make matters. And here Japan benefits greatly from being a major manufacturing power. About a third of Japanese GDP derives from the manufacturing sector, far higher than the figures for Germany, the USA, or France. This is a country which is a major car manufacturer, one of the biggest civilian ship manufacturers in the world, and includes giants in other fields, including high-tech electronics. A lot of Japan's major military manufacturing is in fact done by companies that would have quite familiar names. The difficult bit, of course, is remembering who manufactures what, so here's a bit of a cheat sheet. Most of the fighter aircraft, those are manufactured by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. The tanks and the self-propelled guns are manufactured by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Most of the missiles, the warships, the engines, gas turbines, those are manufactured instead by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. And often what happens in the Japanese defense sector is whenever a company wants to exit defense manufacturing, it will usually sell its defense operations to another company like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. I hope that helped clear things up. Now, Japan doesn't have the resources to do everything itself, particularly on the R&D front. And so Japan actually is a major importer of military technology, but what it's very good at is integrating imported systems, often from the United States, into other systems of indigenous design. Some things are just imported more or less as is. This is the case with the Japanese F-35s. Although even there, a lot of the final assembly is done in Japan at a facility in Nagoya, jointly operated by Lockheed Martin and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Then there are a variety of systems which combine imported technology and local components to create a hybrid platform. The F-2 aircraft, the Soryu-class submarine, which combines Japanese design with a Swedish air-independent propulsion system. And when you're talking about Japan's Aegis-equipped warships, obviously those are usually Japanese-designed and manufactured hulls. But for Aegis to work, they have American missiles, American sensors, all the components of the Aegis combat system. This ability to combine imported and local technology is part of what allows the Japanese defense industrial base to do what it does. And it's something it now seems Japan will be doing again with its cooperation with the UK and other countries as part of the GCAP 6th generation fighter program. Now, on one hand, Japanese defense industry has a number of things going for it. It has that civilian sector that it can build off. Japan has a lot of shipyards and manufacturing capability that obviously has some transferability over to military production. It's also still a world leader in certain fields like materials science. There are also some defense contracts that are incredibly stable, predictable, and long-running. When you're talking about things like shipbuilding, predictability is king. There's no quicker way to drive up costs than to have the schedule change every year as a result of fights in Parliament, for example. But some Japanese contracts are very stable. In March every year since 2009, Japan has commissioned exactly one new Soryu-class submarine. That's the kind of predictability that lets a workforce build up skills, a supply chain get optimized, the whole system finds its rhythm. But there are also threats to the Japanese DIB as well. For one, some contracts may be predictable, but production scale is often very low. Japan has long heavily restricted the export of military technology, which is how most nations that aren't superpowers access the sort of scale that is required to build systems efficiently. There's also the problem that the labour force is ageing and shrinking, and that, at least to speak anecdotally, margins in the Japanese defence manufacturing sector are very low. Someone who's getting a margin of 7% historically has won the jackpot. A lot of companies will operate low single digits or even close to zero. If you're making handbags or business shirts, you might be aiming for a 500% retail markup. But in Japan, if you're a defence manufacturer, you have exactly one client. They know that, and the margin reflects it. So if that's all the status quo, how does Japan intend to change things going forward? It's time to talk about Japan's strategic thinking and its upcoming plans. Now, some nations are very secretive about their defense strategies. Japan, meanwhile, publishes a 500-plus page document, obligingly translates it into English, gives it a snazzy cover, and puts it on the internet. Defense of Japan 2022 is the longest and most comprehensive of the documents published towards the end of 2022. And despite the length, I would recommend it as a potential read. Now, I understand Japanese strategic thinking probably doesn't often come up as a topic at parties. But if by chance it does, having read this document and a couple of the others, you will be well prepared. Because it covers Japanese understanding of the security environment, security and defense concepts, the pillars of Japanese national defense, and the key elements of Japanese defense capability. If you've watched some of my previous videos, all of those terms should by now be pretty familiar to you. Some of the most critical content revolves around the Japanese understanding or perceptions of their security environment. Japan identifies a couple of broad strokes issues, an overarching trend of intensifying interstate competition and challenges to the existing international order, specific security challenges in the Indo-Pacific, and Russia's attempt to unilaterally change the status quo by force, which is a statement in relation to the invasion of Ukraine. There are some individual snippets that probably aren't that surprising. For example, the statement that Taiwan is an extremely important partner for Japan, based on the recognition that changes to the status quo by coercion are globally shared challenges, which is diplomatic speak for saying that Japan feels it has an interest in making sure that the status of the island of Taiwan isn't changed as a result of the use of military force. It also reflects that DPRK military activities, quote, pose grave and imminent threats to Japan's security, and also that the People's Republic of China is, quote, relentlessly continuing unilateral attempts to change the status quo by coercion, quote. One phrase you'll become very familiar with if you read through this document is that last one there, change to the status quo by coercion. Japan is deeply opposed to the idea that a nation might move borders or change the status quo either through the use of force or the threatened use of force. And based on the history and strategy section, that probably makes sense to you. Japan's constitution rejects the right of the nation to use military force in that way. And the Japanese economy is really vulnerable to the types of disruptions that might happen if a war were to break out. And so the Japanese appear deeply concerned with making sure that those sort of attempts don't happen. To help crystallize these ideas and move outside the document for a moment, there's a recent quote from Major General Joel Val. He's an American general commanding US Army Japan, I believe. And in reference to the thinking of some of his Japanese colleagues, he put it this way, quote, China is like Russia, Taiwan is like Ukraine, Japan is like Poland, and the Philippines is like Romania. I think that's far from perfect as an analogy, but it may help bring some of the point home. New technological developments also get a lot of attention in this and other Japanese documents. It goes back to what I said earlier about Japan's historical military thinking often only having two settings, deep conservatism and rapid cutting-edge modernization. If the Japanese military was a tradesman and you asked them to hammer in a nail, you might come back later to find them banging it in with a rock instead of using a hammer because that's the way their great-great-grandfather did it. But if it becomes clear that's no longer going to work because everyone else is now using the hammers, well, you might come back a week later and find out they've designed a robot to hammer in the thing for them. And so these Japanese documents talk extensively about developments in relatively high-tech fields, electromagnetic warfare, manned-unmanned teaming, railguns, high-powered microwaves, artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, space domain, and hypersonics. But don't worry, we'll come back to all of those soon. The document also anchors Japan's defense around three key pillars. The first is Japan's own defense architecture, its ability to build domestic capability to do disaster relief and to defend remote islands. Remember, Japan administers a bunch of remote islands, some quite far away from the Japanese home islands themselves. And the document makes very clear that the Japanese SDF is expected to be able to retake those islands in the event that any are ever captured. Pillar 2 is the alliance with the United States, and Pillar 3 is security cooperation with other countries. Put them together and you have a pretty good idea of how Japan intends to build up its own national defense. Build up their own strength, make as many friends as possible, and make sure Uncle Sam is waiting on the sidelines with the chair. But instead of talking generally, let's get systematic like we have in some of our previous videos. There's usually a flow to how defense investments are decided. You don't start by just buying everything shiny on the international market and then figuring out how you're going to use it. You start by figuring out what you need to be able to do, and everything else flows from there. Between the Defense of Japan 2022 document and Japan's 2022 defense strategy, they set out some general objectives. These are to shape a security environment that does not tolerate, and again here's that phrase, unilateral changes to the status quo by force or coercion. Secondly, to deter and respond to attempts to unilaterally change the status quo by coercion, which is very diplomatic language but translated into modern vernacular essentially means start shit, get hit. And thirdly, in the event that deterrence fails and any Japanese territory, including outlying islands, is threatened, Japan wants the self-defense forces to be able to take the lead in defeating that invasion. As for the broad concept of how, those are closely related to the three pillars: Japan's own military strength, the alliance with the United States, and collaboration with like-minded countries, which Japan broadly sees as other states, mostly but not exclusively in the Indo-Pacific, who also have an interest in discouraging other powers, whoever they may be, from attempting to change the status quo through military force or coercion. After setting out some general objectives, Japan defines some more specific ones. What specifically does the JSDF need to be able to do? And here there are two main benchmarks. Within 5 years, so by 2027, the JSDF needs to be able to take primary responsibility for disrupting and defeating any invasion of Japan. Noting here that Japan obviously includes the outlying islands administered by that country. Japan isn't willing, for example, to just sacrifice Okinawa if war ever does break out. Within 10 years, the self-defense forces need to be able to disrupt and defeat invasion much earlier and at places farther afield, which means maybe the threat never gets that close to the Japanese home islands or Japanese territory. Maybe it's destroyed closer to its point of embarkation, which, all else being equal, probably reduces the risk of significant damage to Japanese civilian infrastructure and populations. Dragging your opponent into an urban battle space might be a great way to give defending forces an advantage, but it's not going to do much for the people who live there or for local property values. And it would be rare to find a government that doesn't care about at least one of those two things. Having defined objectives, what you want the JSDF to be able to do, you can start talking about the requirements for capabilities and finally talk about buying some equipment. At which point you find yourself looking at a third published Japanese document, the Defence Build-Up Plan. This was published later, right at the end of 2022, and I'm working with a provisional English translation that was released in March. This gets much more into the nitty-gritty of what sort of capabilities the JSDF needs and some of how they intend to go about getting them. Now, there are a lot of individual items, but they do sort of group together. For example, Japan sets out a need to be able to disrupt and defeat invasion forces over long distances. So that requires better integrated air and missile defense systems and standoff long-range weapons. Japan wants tools to give it an asymmetric advantage if deterrence fails. And so here they talk about unmanned assets and cross-domain capabilities. Or when they talk about the need to be able to act swiftly and persistently, that is, to move quickly in response and then to maintain that response as long as needed. Well, that might include investment in anything from ammunition stockpiling to transport helicopters. I'm going to go through some of the big highlight buy items now. But one key item I want to highlight up front is this personal observation. Most of what this plan is talking about, most of what Japan intends to spend its money on, it's not really large numbers of new personnel. It's not about making the JSDF significantly larger. The documents openly acknowledge the fact that increasing the number of volunteer recruits is probably going to be really difficult given Japanese demographics. Instead, the focus is on buying stuff and modernization. It's about research, metal, and munitions more than it is about manpower. There will be some force enlargements, I'll cover them as we go through. But when we're talking about dollar or yen values, remember that most militaries spend an awful lot of their money on personnel costs, pensions, etc. So when Japan says they want to spend tens or hundreds of billions of dollars primarily on procurement, that's an awful lot of procurement. And as you're about to find out, Japan doesn't exactly have humble ambitions in this area. The first item on the list, and the one that's captured by far the most international attention, is the focus on acquiring standoff capabilities. And as an aside, as we go through these, keep an eye out for any of these priorities that you think might partly be a lessons learned from the Ukraine war so far. Now, at the moment, Japan has nothing in the way of cruise missiles or very long-range munitions. They have the ability to shoot down aircraft and ballistic missiles. They have the ability to torpedo ships or engage them with short and medium-range anti-ship missiles. But traditionally speaking, Japanese thinking has often viewed things like cruise missiles as war-making potential, as offensive weapons, and as a result has refused to possess them. But as the war in Ukraine has demonstrated, you're at a tremendous disadvantage if your opponent has long-range weapon systems and you don't. And these strategy documents also point out the fact that given the proliferation and improvement of missile technologies in the Indo-Pacific region, relying on defense alone, just the ability to shoot down incoming missiles, is becoming less reliable as a solution. And so what the new Japanese thinking is basically arguing is that counter-strike potential is now super important. If you're going to deter an opponent, or if you're going to breach an area denial strategy, you need the ability to strike back from long distance. Otherwise, it's like telling me that I'm going into a fight with a heavyweight boxer, but I'm guaranteed that all he's ever going to do is block. In that situation, I might say, yeah, I'll go in the ring, because the worst thing that could possibly happen is I might tire myself out. But if he's allowed to throw punches back, well then, I'm definitely going to think twice. And so Japan has finally made the choice to possess long-range weapons. And because this is Japan and Japan doesn't do half measures, we're not talking about buying a few dozen missiles. We're talking about a multifaceted program that's going to give Japan some serious teeth. In the short term, Japan is buying roughly 400 modern Tomahawk missiles from the United States. And these aren't your Desert Storm era early Block Tomahawks either. These are probably going to be either Block 4 or Block 5s mounted on Japanese warships. Block 5s can't just hit static targets on land, they can reportedly engage even moving targets at sea. At the same time, Japan's looking at extending the range of its existing Type 12 missile. This is much smaller, lighter and cheaper than Tomahawk, and it's optimised for the anti-shipping role. The document speaks to an intention to get the ground-launched version in service in fiscal year 25, the naval version in fiscal year 26, and the air-launched version in fiscal year 28. So we're up to 3 missile systems so far. Let's add a 4th. The document references an unknown number of anti-ship missiles optimised for island defence. And curiously, those missiles are meant to include low radar cross-section. That is, they're meant to be a little bit stealthy. So if you're keeping track, that's 1 American solution for domestic solutions. And to that, Japan adds a commitment to diversifying its launch platforms, not just adding everything to its warships, for example, but also potentially doing things like introducing vertical launch systems on its submarines. If Japan were to do that, not only would an opponent have to be aware of its long-range capabilities, they'd also be unlikely to know where all of those missiles are at any given time. America does this with the VLS systems on many of its nuclear-powered submarines. Japan's smaller submarines would presumably have less missile carrying capacity, but less is not zero. Then there's reference to another suite of solutions for the problem of remote island defense. This is essentially Japan trying to solve the problem of how does it provide credible deterrence of an island that might not have any permanent personnel stationed on it. The answer is you need to be able to hit it with weapons stationed elsewhere, hypersonic or otherwise. And despite coming in as a relatively late entrant to the hypersonic race, Japan has set itself some pretty impressive timelines. One requirement is what they call the Hypervelocity Gliding Projectile, HVGP. Basically, this is a system that would be launched into high altitude by a rocket and then descend at hypersonic velocity into a target. It would have some maneuvering capability, but it wouldn't be powered. Japan is talking about bringing the Block 1, which is intended to hit static ground targets, into service by fiscal year 2025, and the Block 2 capable of hitting potentially moving naval targets some years after that. But presumably that second date would be before fiscal year 2031, because by that point Japan's saying they want to have a functional, maneuverable hypersonic missile completed and in service. You can see why I made the comparison to the adoption of firearms earlier in this video. Having finally decided that it's going to adopt long-range weapons, Japan hasn't decided to just adopt a few legacy systems. They want multiple systems in quantity at an extremely high level of capability, with some of them being world-leading hypersonic weapon systems. And they want some of them hitting the field in just a couple of years. As an interesting coincidence, I will note that many of these systems are targeting entry into service by fiscal year 2026. On a completely unrelated note, it's been reported that President Xi Jinping has ordered the People's Liberation Army to be ready for potential cross-strait operations by 2027. What a strange coincidence, I don't know why I brought that up. If the investment in long-range munitions is about giving Japan at last a sword with which to strike back against a potential opponent, the investment in air and missile defense is a more traditional Japanese focus on the shield part of the equation. Here again, Japan's got a relatively long shopping list. New missiles and radars for its existing Patriot missile systems, upgrades to the Type 03 surface-to-air missile so that it can engage both ballistic missiles and hypersonic threats. New anti-ballistic missiles, new long-range ship-to-air missiles, so the SM-3 Block 2A and the SM-6. And 2 more ships equipped with the Aegis combat system dedicated to the anti-ballistic missile role. That is, these ships would have one job. They would carry lots and lots of anti-ballistic missiles. The goal then would be to free up the other Aegis-equipped ships to focus on other jobs like shooting down enemy aircraft and protecting fleets. There's also just a general focus on interceptor count and better networking, because as the war in Ukraine is demonstrating, the quality of your air defense assets does matter, but so does their quantity and endurance. There's also a huge focus on unmanned systems, including small and cheap ones, both as a potential tool to be utilised, but also a threat to be defended against. Again, you can almost see some of the experience from the war in Ukraine directly translating over to this sort of thinking. The Japanese dedicate significant thinking to defending against massed attacks by cheap and affordable drones. But here the difference between Ukrainian and Japanese thinking really comes through. To deal with Lancet loitering munitions attacking their artillery, the Ukrainians have built nets around them. To shoot down Shahed 136, the Ukrainians have used tools like heavy machine guns with thermal scopes on them, or Pavel and his mates chasing after them on quad bikes while carrying stingers. As for Japan, it's Japan, so Japan's looking at high-energy lasers and high-powered microwave weapons, which can make a lot of sense against cheaper targets because electricity is generally cheaper than something like a Stinger missile, and it's relatively easy to hit a target using something that's moving at the speed of light. Meanwhile, Japan is looking to increase its use of drones for just about every application imaginable. There's talk of using drones to reduce labour usage, unmanned ground vehicles to support ground combat elements, unmanned ships augmenting manned platforms, and even situations where you have drones controlling drones. With one existing example being that you can have a semi-submerged drone which receives instructions from a ship, and then it transmits at close distance instructions to other submerged smaller drones that are doing a particular job. It's reported Japan already has such a system in service for detecting underwater mines, which does make sense because detecting and clearing mines, like speaking first at a corporate icebreaker, is something most reasonable people will not voluntarily do if given the choice. Next up are a suite of investments in cross-domain operations and intelligence, which is a fancy way of saying that war isn't fought on some 2D chessboard. War plays out in space and in the digital domain, not just on the physical 2D land battlefield. And so there are investments across the board. In space, Japan is talking about employing satellite constellations to enable targeting, tracking, and missile defense. On the cyber warfare side, they're talking about improved coordination and practices, and enlarging the MOD and Self-Defense Forces cyber defense personnel complement to 20,000 by 2027. Now, given that the current self-defense forces are something like 250,000 strong, that's a very high computer nerd to trigger puller ratio, and it reflects an understanding of what modern hybrid warfare might look like. On the electromagnetic side, there's procurements of new network electronic warfare systems, signals detection equipment, and ground-to-air jammers. Again, Russian use of electronic warfare has been a key area of study emerging out of the Ukraine war, and it may be that we're seeing some of that experience filter through in the thinking in Japan half a world away. Add to that a grab bag of programs in the command and control and intelligence-related functions. So this includes cloud upgrades and IT programs. Now, a few dates are provided there, but based on previous government IT programs around the world, I think we have to guess a completion date of between 2050 and 2060, and a total cost overrun that sits somewhere between exotic getaway and oligarch yacht. Particularly interesting to me, however, is the mention of defensive measures against information warfare. If you've watched my video last week, you'll understand why that might be particularly significant based on the experience in Ukraine. And then finally, the case of ChatGPT's Japanese cousin going to war, because Japan is clearly very interested in the potential of AI to assist in military functions. In particular, and potentially, the automatic collection and analysis of open source intelligence. So there you go, the robots really are coming for our jobs. It's been nice knowing all of you. The penultimate thing I wanted to cover is making the whole force more deployable. Again, increasingly built on the assumption that any opponent of Japan probably won't obligingly come to the Japanese home island and have a battle there. To that end, you're looking at the Japanese self-defense forces move more towards deployable units with more organic intelligence, fires, ground-based air defenses, and logistics. There's going to be more transport helicopters, more aerial refueling capacity, more container trailers. Meanwhile, one of Japan's only 4 deployed forces, that is the 15th Brigade on Okinawa, will be upgraded from a brigade to a division. So you're looking at an SDF that's more capable of sending independent reinforcements to potential hotspots, and with an enlarged and more capable forward deployed force. The final area I wanted to call out could come straight out of the Ukraine Tentative Lessons Learned playbook. The heading here is sustainability and resilience, but a lot of this comes down to buying a lot of munitions. Russia went into its full-scale invasion with some of the world's largest stocks of artillery ammunition, long-range missiles, you name it. And yet even it has become supply constrained in those areas while NATO powers struggle to manufacture everything that Ukraine requires. And so Japan is talking about stockpiling more of basically everything, more standoff munitions, more ballistic missile interceptors, more air defense missiles, more artillery shells. It's talking about purchasing additional fuel, building new storage locations, building out its logistics, expanding its warehouses, expanding the capability of the defense industrial base, and even hardening some critical facilities against electromagnetic pulses. Because nothing says everything is fine and stable in the world like people rushing to harden their headquarters against the side effects of nuclear detonations. But while all of that is extremely interesting, and does signal what a sea change we've seen in Japanese strategic thinking, it only speaks to one of the three pillars of Japan's defence strategy. Because Japan, much like nations like Germany, isn't particularly comfortable with the idea of ever going it alone. Japanese thinking puts immense focus on the idea of collective security and alliances. And so to do Japanese strategy any justice, I need to talk about that briefly here. For Japan, a key security cornerstone is the alliance with the United States. This is particularly important as Japan doesn't have nuclear weapons, and so it relies on the United States to provide extended nuclear deterrence against the nuclear-armed nations in its region, like North Korea. Now, it's important to stress that the alliance between Japan and the US has not always been without tension or change. The original 1952 treaty was written at a time when Japan was just coming out of Allied occupation and as a result was blatantly unfair. America, for example, had the right to station troops in Japan and use them to intervene in the region without Japanese permission and also accrued no responsibility to actually, defend Japan. That led to considerable protests, and in 1960 a far more equal treaty was signed, which is the basis of the current relationship. The other point of tension has long been around the basing of US forces on Okinawa. Okinawa represents a tiny portion of Japanese territory and population, but because of its strategic position, it accounted for the lion's share of American forces stationed in Japanese territory. There have been high-profile altercations, even crimes committed by American servicemen. And as a result, polling of the Japanese public generally reveals support for moving some American forces from Okinawa to other Japanese territory, just usually with the caveat that they never be moved to that person's territory. American military bases in Japan are kind of like wind turbines. Everyone wants them to exist, but no one wants them in their backyard. But despite these tensions, public and political support for the US alliance in Japan is overwhelming. And it remains a cornerstone not just of Japanese, but also of American strategy. If you're talking about US bases close to the Taiwan Strait, Okinawa is about as close as it gets. And while sure, aircraft carriers are great, it's historically very difficult to sink an island. And so if you look at Japanese documents, there are specific areas they often identify where Allied coordination is particularly important or useful. Cooperating on space, cyber warfare, ISRT, or intelligence sharing, for example, makes perfect sense. Those are fields where the whole can be greater than the sum of the individual parts, so sharing can massively increase the value of what each individual nation has. But there are also other fields where cooperation is flagged, things like the cooperative posturing of counter-strike capabilities, that is, forcing your opponent to take account of not just your long-range missiles, but what your ally might be able to bring to the table. And then there's areas like ballistic missile defense, particularly when you're focused on something like North Korea. Realistically, there is no possibility of American or Japanese missile defenses stopping an all-out ICBM attack from the People's Republic of China or the Russian Federation. But a much smaller, less developed arsenal like that of the DPRK, that potentially could be seen off by missile defenses. And the United States, South Korea, and Japan all have a shared interest in having the capacity to shoot down any rogue North Korean missiles. And so you've seen joint ballistic missile defense exercises, in which the US is not just the major military partner, but also, in a sense, sometimes you could argue the glue. Remember that Japanese-Korean relations aren't always fantastic, but both have very close alliances with the United States. You need to remember that this isn't NATO. The Pacific allies don't have the same monolithic joint command structures and organisation that NATO has behind it. And so if you want these forces to be able to coordinate in a crisis, you need to work at it. You need to invest in that cooperation and you need to practice it. And that discussion leads into the last point here, which is looking beyond the American alliance to the broader security alliances in the region. Japan expresses a desire to work with what it calls like-minded countries towards a free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, this obviously isn't just about military cooperation, it's about humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, equipment and technology cooperation. But it is also about military dialogue and joint exchanges. And to that end, a few nations appear specifically mentioned in these documents. I can't go through all of them, but the Republic of Korea, Australia, the Philippines. And critically, because I want to tease a future video here, India. because Japan describes India as a nation which shares its fundamental values and which has geographical and historical ties to the Indo-Pacific region. Japan places great emphasis on its relationship with India, its exercises and exchanges, including those that occur through the Quad format, which for those of you who don't know is a reference to the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is an organisation that brings together Australia, India, Japan and the United States, and in its Quad Plus format adds New Zealand, South Korea and Vietnam. Now, the Quad is focused on security issues. The member nations have held very large-scale naval exercises. And in 2021, the members stated that they shared a vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, a rules-based maritime order in the East and South China Seas. It's this kind of nuance that makes me want to do an Indian video someday, because there is this never-ending attempt to simplify Indian foreign policy. India purchases oil and weapons from the Russian Federation, it cooperates with China in the BRICS format on some economic issues, and then it participates in the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, aligning with Australia, the United States and Japan. India isn't simple and shouldn't be simplified. But in a security context, the Japanese see the Indians as important partners, not as military allies in the same way they might see a country like the United States, but as a growing influential nation with an interest in the Indo-Pacific, and one that Japan views as having an important place in its security strategy, which ultimately relies first not on the idea of successfully winning a war, but rather successfully discouraging and deterring one ever taking place. So that's a bird's eye view of Japan's strategy to bolster its security. But no plan is without risks or challenges, and so I thought I'd look at a few of those to close this video out, along with a few options on how to potentially deal with them. The biggest, and I'd like to stress here we're now moving into the area of personal opinion, is the basic economic challenge of sustaining this build-up over the next 5 to 10 years. It's the same challenge faced by many of the nations in the region. The Republic of Korea, Japan and the PRC all suffer a similar problem. Fewer workers and more retirees is always, all else being equal, going to put more pressure on government budgets. At the same time, recent Japanese growth for decades now has been pretty sluggish. Government debt is very high. Although to be fair, there's a lot of very weird things about the Japanese economy, including its debt, which might merit a discussion one day. Essentially, very little of the Japanese government debt is held by foreigners, and the cost of servicing that debt is much lower than you might expect. But the debt is still there, and margins in industry are pretty tight, so you probably can't squeeze the manufacturers for more of a discount. If Japan is going to pay for this program, it's going to involve sacrifices, it's going to involve opportunity costs. But the public polling I've seen suggests overwhelming majority support. The Japanese people generally seem to view this as something that has to be done. And if the Japanese government chooses to make this a priority no matter the cost, well then it can probably make it happen. The bigger challenge may actually not be in the Japanese defence industrial base, but rather on how the goalposts of the whole program have been set. Remember, the objective here isn't to field a certain number of missiles or a particular capability. Those all exist to achieve objectives. And those objectives revolve around deterring and potentially defeating certain pacing threats. Japan, for example, being able to take the lead in repelling an attack against some of its islands. And in that scenario, it's not just important how many resources you have, but how many resources the OPFOR has. And if we assume for a moment that the OPFOR might be a nation which looks something like the People's Republic of China, then that might be an issue because of just how fast PLA capabilities are growing. Japan, for example, may be planning to double defence spending by 2027. But if Chinese defence expenditure grows at a relatively steady rate, it doesn't need to anywhere near double in order to increase, not decrease, the total difference between its spending and Japan's. No one on Earth is putting military hulls into the water as quickly as the PLAN. And so while this plan may dramatically overhaul the capabilities of the JSDF, that doesn't mean the gap between Japan and its hypothetical opponents will necessarily narrow. Discussing all of the options to offset those challenges is something that could be a video in and of itself. But there may well be room for creativity going forward. The war in Ukraine, for example, has highlighted that sometimes quantities does still have a quality all of its own. And so Japan might be looking for relatively cheap ways to increase the number of platforms it operates. And one idea to help with that recently featured in The Strategist would simply be to stop throwing stuff away so damn early. As I said earlier, Japan, like clockwork, commissions 1 submarine per year. So the number of submarines in service is going to equal the average lifespan of those submarines. At the moment, that's 22 plus 2, with the plus 2 being submarines that have been converted to just be training boats. Go back several years and the old fleet used to be 16 plus 2. It increased to 22 plus 2 through the mechanism of simply expanding the life of the existing submarines. Instead of throwing them out after 18 years, the Japanese started throwing them out after 24. But in other navies, submarines doing 30 or 35 years of service isn't particularly remarkable. It'd probably require life extension works, but most of Japanese submarines have already been pretty heavily modernised, and it's certainly going to be far cheaper than increasing the rate of production on new boats. Now, it's obviously more complicated than that, but in a world in which Russia is pulling T-55s out of storage to fight in Ukraine, maybe there's room for a few more platforms in the JSDF that have lost that new submarine smell. The other option is already deeply entwined in Japanese strategy, and that's the potential for collaboration and cooperation. Japan is always going to have trouble achieving scale in its R&D efforts and in its procurement. It just isn't buying in the quantities or spending the sort of money that its potential rivals are. And so it probably needs to look for ways to secure that scale and to pool resources. That probably means things like further relaxing export rules so Japanese defence manufacturers can access the international market and secure some desperately needed scale. Or it might mean cooperating with other countries to share cost and risk when it comes to research and development. The massive announcement here was Japan giving up its dream to produce its own 6th-generation fighter. Instead, it's now partnering with the United Kingdom, Italy, and potentially Sweden on the Global Combat Air Program. Japanese industry, scientists, and engineers can no doubt bring a lot to that program. But by signing up with allies, they can not just split the cost, they can also guarantee that whatever aircraft is eventually adopted through that program will have multiple buyers already lined up. These programs are so expensive, so difficult, that it's probably unrealistic for a nation like Japan to go it alone anymore. If you're not the United States or the People's Republic of China, you're probably going to need help. Time will tell if Japan applies that same logic to any of its other weapons development programs. In conclusion, the invasion of Ukraine and other threats have catalyzed a major response in Japanese strategic thinking. Japan's objectives from a strategic standpoint are focused on the ability to defend all of Japan's territory from a longer and longer distance as time goes on. But beyond that, there's an intense focus on avoiding scenarios where there are, quote, attempts to change the status quo by coercion. Japan's security and economic prosperity depend on stability and freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific, and so its efforts to build both capabilities and alliances are directed towards that goal. Those efforts are certainly ambitious, they're likely to face challenges going forward, but the determination and public support seems to be there, and so I think in 5 years' time we're probably going to see a very different Japanese self-defense force. Okay, channel update to close out. And I know I can't get away with ignoring this, so here it is. I crossed 400,000 subscribers, which is an incredibly humbling thing to say and certainly not something I ever thought I'd utter. In case you haven't figured it out yet, I do defense economic PowerPoints on the internet. That is not something I ever thought would have significant demand attached to it. But over the last 13 months, the support that I have received has been truly incredible. And so while I try and come up with some way to reflect the fact that that milestone has been passed, for the moment, just let me thank you for being here and your ongoing engagement and support. On that note, this video was a continuation of me moving through the topics that patrons have voted for. I'm very aware of the fact that I don't offer merch or any of that shiny stuff, unlike some other creators. And so I'm always thrilled when I can take a topic that interests patrons and make it a reality. I'd also like to thank the surge of people who are coming forward to offer help with translations. The way I'm handling this is to try and onboard one individual language at a time, getting the people understanding it from a technical perspective, getting the production running, and then going from there. So French is the current test case that I'm working on, and once we've got the technical issues solved there, we'll move on to the next one. That's a good reminder for me to extend continuing thanks both to my ever-suffering sound guy, and also to the bloke who does my English language subtitles every week without fail. I've thanked you both privately, but here it is in a public forum. Finally, there has been some small-scale activity on the gaming channel. Obviously very humble compared to this one, just where I have a little bit of spare time. But if you are interested, just be aware there is some activity over there too. As I said, thank you very much to all of you, and I will see you all again